There is one thing you can do, not a game, not a tactic, not a carefully constructed performance designed to produce a reaction, that lands inside an avoidance psychology with more force than anything else you could say or demonstrate or patiently endure. It is not dramatic. It does not involve a speech or a confrontation or the satisfaction of finally saying everything you have been holding. It does not require them to be present for it or even aware of it in the moment it occurs. And it is not something you can decide to do. It is something you arrive at. Something that happens to you after a certain amount of living through what you have been living through. After a certain threshold of clarity has been reached, after the part of you that was still organizing itself around their emotional weather finally quietly stops. The one move is this. You become genuinely unavailable to be destabilized by them. Not unavailable in the physical sense. Not unreachable or silent or deliberately withholding in a way that is still, underneath, oriented toward their response. Genuinely, internally, structurally unavailable to be moved off your own ground by whatever they do or don't do, by whether they reach or retreat, by the temperature of their attention or the quality of their silence. You become, in the most complete sense, your own. And that, to the avoidant psychology, is the equivalent of the ground shifting beneath their feet. To understand why this particular move breaks something in the avoidance reality, you have to understand what their reality has been built on, not consciously. Not as a deliberate construction, but structurally, in the way that all psychological realities are built, through the accumulation of repeated experience that eventually becomes expectation, an expectation that eventually becomes something indistinguishable from fact. The avoidance relational reality has been built, over years and across multiple relationships, on a foundational expectation that functions something like this. If I create enough distance, the person will pursue. If I withdraw, the connection will still be there when I return. If I manage the level of intimacy, the other person will absorb the management and remain available. The dynamic has a known shape, a predictable architecture. And within that architecture, the avoidant has always occupied a specific position. The one who holds the withdrawal card, who controls the temperature, who determines the distance. The one for whom the door is always open regardless of how rarely they choose to walk through it. That position is not power in the conscious, calculated sense. It is not something they chose deliberately. It is the position their attachment system assigned them, because it is the only position in which closeness feels survivable. Being the one who could leave at any moment, even if they never actually leave, is the thing that makes staying possible. The exit being available is what allows them to remain. And you, for the duration of what you shared, were the architecture that made that position possible. Not because you were weak or naive or insufficiently aware of the dynamic, but because you loved them. Because genuine love, especially in its early and most hopeful form, tends to make people available, responsive, oriented toward the connection even when the connection is not consistently oriented toward them. You showed up, you stayed available. You absorbed the distance without disappearing, and in doing so, however genuinely, however beautifully, you confirmed repeatedly and reliably the foundational expectation that the door would remain open. Every time you reached after a withdrawal, the expectation was confirmed. Every time you softened after a cooling, the architecture was reinforced. Every time you found a way to need less, ask less, accommodate more, the avoidance system logged it, filed it under known, predictable, safe to continue the pattern with. And then something changed. In you, not as a decision made strategically, as an arrival. The arrival of someone who had absorbed enough, waited enough, reached enough, and had finally, organically, run out of the specific kind of hope that made the reaching feel worth it. The arrival of someone who had grown, through the specific education of this experience, into a version of themselves that was no longer organized around the avoidance emotional weather. That arrival broke the architecture. Because here is what the avoidance system encountered when your genuine unavailability registered. Not anger, not withdrawal performed as a countermove, not a new distance that was still, underneath, a response to their distance. Something it had no existing category for. Something that did not fit into the known shape of the dynamic. A person who was present, not cold, not punishing, not dramatically altered, but somehow no longer reachable in the specific way they had always been reachable before. No longer available to be moved off their own ground by the usual levers. The usual levers. This is important. The avoidance deactivating strategies are not just internal, they have external components. They work partly through the other person's response. The withdrawal produces pursuit. The cooling produces warmth seeking. The ambiguity produces the anxious energy of someone trying to resolve it. And all of those responses, the pursuit, the warmth seeking, the anxiety, feed back into the avoidance system as confirmation that the dynamic is intact, that the expected shape of things is holding, that the world is, relationally speaking, predictable. When your response changes, when the withdrawal no longer produces pursuit, when the cooling no longer produces warmth seeking, when the ambiguity no longer produces anxious energy, but instead produces a quiet, settled, almost eerie stability, the feedback loop breaks. The system reaches for the expected response and finds something else entirely. And something else entirely, to a psychology built on the expectation of the predictable, is profoundly disorienting. The disorientation is not immediately visible. The avoidant does not suddenly become transparent, does not externally display the internal shift in any obvious way. What happens is quieter and more internal than that. It is a recalibration that occurs without announcement, a moment or a series of moments where the usual assessment of the situation keeps returning unexpected results. They reach for the known shape of the dynamic, and it is not there. They calibrate the distance and find that the distance is no longer functioning the way distance functions when someone is waiting on the other side of it. They look for the familiar texture of your orientation toward them, the quality of attention, the readiness to respond, the slight lean in your direction that was always present even when you were trying not to show it, and they find that the texture has changed, that the lean is gone. Not replaced by coldness, replaced by something that is fully directed elsewhere, toward your own life, your own ground, your own unfolding. And the absence of the lean, the absence of the orientation they had come to rely on without ever consciously acknowledging the reliance, that absence is the ground shifting. That is the move that breaks their reality. Not because it was designed to, but because it is the one thing their entire psychological architecture was not built to accommodate. The reality that breaks is specific. It is the reality in which they are the one who holds the withdrawal card, in which the dynamic has a known shape, in which the door is always open regardless of how it is treated. That reality, which was never a conscious belief but a structural expectation, cannot survive contact with your genuine indifference to whether they use the card, with your genuine comfort in the ambiguity they were relying on to keep you slightly off balance, with your genuine orientation toward a life that is full and sustaining and does not have a U-shaped hole at its center that only they can fill. When that reality breaks, what replaces it is not immediately comfortable for them. It is not the clean, relieved discomfort of someone who has been caught in a pattern and is now free of it. It is a more confused, more destabilizing experience. The experience of someone whose map no longer matches the territory, whose predictions keep failing, whose sense of where they stand, which was never something they examined closely because it never needed to be examined, because it was always reliably confirmed, suddenly requires examination because it is no longer reliable. Where do they stand? The question, which used to answer itself automatically, now genuinely requires an answer. And the process of arriving at that answer forces a confrontation with things the avoidant has been successfully avoiding. How much the connection mattered. How much the predictability of your availability was functioning as a form of security they never named as security. How much the managed distance was costing them as well as you. How different the dynamic feels from the inside when the other person is no longer absorbing the cost of it quietly. That confrontation is uncomfortable in a way that the deactivating strategies cannot efficiently address. Because the deactivating strategies work by reducing investment in the connection, by generating distance, finding faults, minimizing the attachment, but those strategies require a connection that is still present and still generating the intimacy that needs to be managed. When your genuine unavailability removes the intimacy-generating quality from the equation, when there is nothing immediate and close and warm to manage, the deactivating strategies are addressing a situation that is already changed. They are late. Responding to a dynamic that no longer exists in the form they were designed to handle. And in the gap between the strategy and the changed situation, something unmanaged gets through. Something the strategies were perpetually preventing from reaching full conscious awareness. The actual size of the attachment. The actual weight of what was being managed. The actual cost of the position they occupied. The one that felt like freedom, but was, in many ways, its own kind of confinement. Confinement to the role of the one who withdraws. The one who manages. The one who is never fully in and never fully out. Who pays for the safety of the exit with the richness of the experience they could have had if they had stayed. The richness of the experience they could have had, that is perhaps the sharpest part of the breaking. Because when the reality shifts, when your genuine unavailability forces the recalibration, one of the things that becomes visible to the avoidant is the full picture of what the dynamic actually was. Not just the comfortable version, where they maintain necessary autonomy and the relationship existed at a manageable level. The complete version, where someone real showed up, completely and consistently, and was met with management rather than presence. Where love was offered at full volume and received at reduced volume, not because the love was insufficient, but because the receiver system could not process it at its actual size. That picture of what was offered and what was actually received is confronting in a way that requires genuine honesty to sit with. It requires the avoidant to acknowledge, at least internally, that the management had a cost that was paid entirely by you. That the dynamic was not neutral, that the withdrawal was not cost-free just because it felt necessary. That the person on the other side of it, the one who is now genuinely unavailable to be destabilized, who is now oriented fully toward their own life, that person absorbed something real, for a real period of time, and has now done the internal work of releasing it. And the releasing is visible. That is the part that breaks the reality most completely. Not the pain. Pain would be familiar, would fit into the known shape of things. The releasing. The evidence of someone who moved through the experience and came out the other side genuinely lighter, genuinely their own, genuinely free of the orientation toward the avoidance emotional weather that was, for so long, the organizing principle of their relational life. That freedom witnessed from the avoidance position is the mirror they have been successfully avoiding. It shows them what the dynamic looked like from the outside, what it cost, what it produced in the person who lived through it, and what that person became on the other side of surviving it. What they see in that mirror is not what they expected to see. The expectation, formed over the course of the dynamic, reinforced by every accommodation you made, every reach after every withdrawal, was that the person on the other side of their management was defined by the dynamic, shaped by it in a way that made them in some sense dependent on it, not maliciously perceived that way, but filed in the avoidance internal categorization system under someone whose primary orientation was toward this connection, whose energy, whose attention, whose emotional availability was primarily pointed here, at them, at the relationship, at the project of maintaining it against the resistance of their inconsistency. That filing made a certain kind of sense given the evidence available at the time, because you were oriented toward it, genuinely, consistently, with the full force of your considerable capacity for love and attention and sustained presence. The filing was not inaccurate as a description of where you were. It was simply mistaken about what that orientation represented. It interpreted your presence as dependency when it was actually devotion. It read your consistency as need when it was actually character. And the distinction between dependency and devotion, between need and character, is one the avoidance system, engaged in its ongoing project of managing attachment, was not particularly motivated to make. Because making that distinction would have required something the management system actively resists. It would have required genuine curiosity about you, about who you actually were underneath the role you occupied in the dynamic, about what your consistency meant as an expression of your character, rather than as a feature of the attachment pattern, about what you were like when you were not in the process of managing your own responses to their management, about the person who existed before this dynamic and would exist after it and was, throughout it, significantly more than the role the dynamic assigned. The avoidance system does not encourage that curiosity. Curiosity about the other person's full humanity increases investment. Increased investment increases vulnerability. Increased vulnerability triggers the alarm system. And so the curiosity gets managed, like everything else, down to a level that feels safe. You become, in the managed version, somewhat flatter than you actually are. More knowable, more containable. More adequately described by your function in the dynamic than by your actual depth. And then you become genuinely unavailable. And the flatness of the managed version cannot survive contact with the evidence of who you actually are in the absence of the dynamic organizing you. Because the person who is genuinely oriented toward their own life, who is building things, feeling things, growing in directions that have nothing to do with the avoidance presence or absence, that person is not flat. That person is not containable in the category of someone whose primary orientation was toward this connection. That person is full, dimensioned, moving, and the movement is what makes the full reality of you land. Finally, in the way it should have landed much earlier but could not, because the management system needed the flattened version in order to function. The landing of the full reality of you is a significant internal event for the avoidant, even if it produces nothing visible, even if it never translates into action or contact or any external acknowledgement. Inside, something reorganizes. The categorization system that had you filed in a certain place, described in certain terms, valued at a certain managed level, that system undergoes a revision that it did not initiate and cannot fully control, because the revision is being driven by evidence, by the accumulating undeniable evidence of a person who is more than the role they occupied, who was always more, who the management system successfully obscured in the service of maintaining a functional distance, and who is now, in their genuine freedom and genuine fullness, impossible to maintain at the managed level. The revision is uncomfortable, not in the dramatic sense of a person in obvious distress, in the quieter sense of someone who keeps returning to a thought they cannot resolve, who finds the usual cognitive strategies, the minimization, the justification, the manufactured indifference, failing to produce their usual result, who sits with something that will not settle into any of the available categories. That does not fit the story the management system told about why the distance was reasonable and the cost was acceptable, and the outcome was, all things considered, fine. It is not fine. The revision keeps returning to that. In whatever form, the avoidance system allows honesty to surface, in dreams, in the disproportionate weight of small triggers, in the strange flatness of interactions with people who are available in all the ways they claim to need. The not fine quality of it keeps finding ways through. Now here is the part that is most important for you to understand. Not for them. For you, because everything described so far, the breaking of their reality, the disorientation, the revision of the categorization system, the not fine quality that keeps finding ways through, all of that is happening inside them and is, in the most fundamental sense, not your business. Not your project, not your responsibility to monitor or respond to or organize your own choices around. The move that broke their reality was not made for them. It was made, arrived at, lived into, for you. The becoming genuinely unavailable to be destabilized was not a strategy deployed in service of a desired response from them. It was the natural outcome of your own growth, of your own internal work, of the slow, unglamorous daily process of building enough of your own life that their emotional weather stopped being the climate you lived in. That distinction is everything. Because the moment the move becomes about their response, the moment you start monitoring whether the reality has broken sufficiently, whether the disorientation is producing the right kind of reaching, whether the revision is moving in the direction you want, you have stepped back out of the genuine freedom the move represents and into a more sophisticated version of the original orientation, still watching them, still organized around their response, still at the level that matters most, pointed outward rather than inward. The genuine version of this, the one that actually breaks their reality rather than performing the breaking, requires you to be so thoroughly oriented toward your own life that the question of whether their reality has broken is genuinely secondary, not suppressed, not denied, genuinely secondary. The way the weather in a city you used to live in is secondary, you might notice it occasionally, might feel a passing interest in how things are going there, but it is no longer the weather you dress for, no longer the forecast that determines your day. That reorientation toward your own life is not a destination you arrive at once and maintain effortlessly. It is a practice, a daily, sometimes moment-to-moment practice of returning to your own ground when the old pull tries to reassert itself. And the old pull will try, especially in the early stages of genuine detachment, especially when something, a piece of news, a mutual connections comment, an unexpected reminder of the texture of what you shared, activates the old orientation suddenly and with surprising force. In those moments, the practice is not the suppression of the feeling. The feeling is allowed, it is human, and it is real, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than management. The practice is what you do after the feeling. Whether you follow it back into the old orientation, back into the monitoring, the wondering, the organizing of yourself around their response, or whether you feel it fully and then return to your own ground, to the life that is actually happening, to the becoming that is actually occurring, to the person you are actually in the process of being. Each return builds something, not dramatically, incrementally, the way any practice builds, through repetition, through the accumulation of small choices made consistently over time, until the choice that once required conscious effort becomes the natural movement of someone who has internalized a different center of gravity. That center of gravity, genuinely located inside yourself rather than in someone else's response to you, is what makes the move that breaks the avoidance reality real rather than performed. And it is also, far more importantly, what makes your own life livable in a way it has not fully been for the duration of the dynamic. Because a life organized around someone else's emotional weather is not fully lived. It is managed. Carefully, exhaustingly, continuously managed in response to conditions that are not yours and cannot be controlled and will never be stable enough to build on. Your own ground is stable. Your own ground does not retreat when you reach for it, does not cool when you need warmth, does not require you to calibrate your needs downward to maintain its presence. It is simply there, consistently, reliably, entirely available to you at full volume. Not the managed, rationed version of presence you became accustomed to, but the complete thing, yours completely, available completely. Standing on that ground, you relate to the entire story differently. The avoidance broken reality becomes something you can observe with genuine compassion rather than the complex mixture of hope and hurt that used to accompany any shift in their behavior. The disorientation they are experiencing is real, and it points toward something important, toward the possibility of their own reckoning, their own growth, their own eventual capacity for a different kind of relating. You can wish that for them, genuinely, without needing to be the recipient of whatever it produces. The story of what happened between you becomes something you can hold with both hands, rather than something that holds you. You can see the love that was real on both sides, the limitation that was real on one side, the cost that was real throughout, the growth that was real in the aftermath. And you can see your own role in it, not with self-criticism, not with the retroactive wish that you had made the move sooner, but with the honest acknowledgement that you made it when you were ready to make it, when the growth that preceded it had been sufficiently built, when the genuine internal shift had actually occurred rather than been performed. Timing in personal growth is not a moral matter. You did not fail by taking as long as you took. You took as long as the process required. And the process, having taken the time it needed, produced something real. Something that could not have been produced faster without being shallower. Something that is, because of the full depth of the experience that generated it, genuinely structural rather than cosmetic. You are different now. Not in the ways that are immediately visible, not necessarily in the ways that would be obvious in a photograph or a resume or a first conversation with someone new, but in the ways that matter most. In the quality of your relationship with your own interior, in the reliability of your own ground, in the discernment that now operates quietly and continuously beneath the level of conscious effort, in the capacity to feel fully without being destabilized, to love genuinely without losing the thread back to yourself, to be moved without being swept away. Those differences are the inheritance of this, the real inheritance, not the broken reality on their end. That is their story to navigate, but the unbreakable reality on yours. The ground that holds regardless of what they do or don't do, regardless of whether the disorientation produces change or simply circulates unresolved. Regardless of whether the too late realization becomes something or remains what too late realizations most often remain, true and private, and ultimately consequential only to the person who carries them. Your reality did not break. It clarified. It became more specifically, more honestly, more durably yours. And from inside that clarity, from the ground that holds, from the center of gravity that is genuinely located in your own life, everything that comes next is approached differently. With the particular quality of presence that belongs to someone who is no longer managing their own heart in deference to someone else's fear, open, grounded, entirely, finally, completely here. There is something that doesn't get discussed enough in conversations about personal growth and the aftermath of difficult relationships. Everyone talks about the healing, the becoming, the arrival at your own ground. And all of that is real and all of that matters. But there is a quieter thing that happens alongside it, something less dramatic and in some ways more profound. And it is this: you start to trust yourself again. Not that the formed confidence of someone who has decided to seem more secure. Not the brittle self-assurance of someone who has built walls and is calling them boundaries. Genuine trust, the kind that comes from having navigated something genuinely difficult and discovered, in the navigating, that you are more reliable than you knew. That your perceptions, even the ones you dismissed and overrode and explained away in service of the hope, those perceptions were accurate. That the part of you that knew something was off, that kept sending signals you kept choosing not to receive, that quietly, persistently, accurately read the situation long before you were ready to act on the reading, that part of you was right. It was right the whole time. The restoration of that trust is not a small thing, because one of the quieter costs of the avoidant dynamic, one that rarely gets named specifically enough, is the erosion of confidence in your own perception. Not through any deliberate gaslighting necessarily, though that can be a feature of some dynamics, but through the structural experience of consistently overriding your own knowing in service of the hope. Every time you felt something was off and talked yourself out of it, you were practicing a kind of internal betrayal, small, seemingly reasonable, motivated by love rather than malice, but cumulative, each instance adding a small deposit to a growing account of self-distrust. By the time the clarity arrived, by the time the full picture became undeniable, you had been practicing the overriding for long enough that your own perceptions had become unreliable narrators in your own story. You knew things and simultaneously didn't trust that you knew them. Felt things and questioned whether the feeling was accurate or the product of your own anxiety or need. Saw things clearly in certain moments and then immediately generated 3 alternative interpretations that required less courage to accept. That doubling, the knowing and the simultaneous doubting of the knowing, is exhausting in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't lived it. It is the cognitive and emotional equivalent of driving with 1 foot on the accelerator and 1 foot on the brake. You are working twice as hard to move half as far. And the part of you that is applying the brake, the part that keeps questioning the accuracy of your own perception, that part was trained into function by repeated experience of the cost of trusting yourself in a dynamic that consistently rewarded the suspension of that trust. The restoration of self-trust happens the same way the erosion happened, incrementally, through repeated small experiences of trusting your perception and finding it accurate, through the practice of letting your first reading of a situation land rather than immediately generating the more optimistic alternative, through noticing the difference in the body, in the quality of your attention, in the particular sensation of something either fitting or not fitting, between a situation that is genuinely good and a situation that is being interpreted as good because the alternative is uncomfortable. That noticing is the practice, and it extends far beyond romantic relationships. It changes how you navigate professional situations where something feels off, but the surface evidence is ambiguous. It changes how you handle friendships where the reciprocity is subtly unequal. It changes how you respond to your own creative instincts, your own ambitions, your own sense of what you want and where you want to be going. Because the self-trust that was eroded was not relationship-specific. And the restoration is not relationship-specific either. It permeates. It moves into every domain where you are required to make a judgment call about your own experience. And as it moves in, something shifts in the texture of daily life that is difficult to attribute to any single change, but is unmistakably present. Things feel more navigable. Not easier necessarily, life does not become uncomplicated, but more navigable because you have a reliable instrument. Because the readings the instrument produces are no longer being systematically discounted. Because you have, in the most practical sense, your own back. Having your own back, that phrase gets used casually enough that its actual meaning can blur. But in the specific context of what you have been through, it has a precise and important content. Having your own back means that when the next situation arises, the next person, the next connection, the next moment where something in you signals caution or notices an inconsistency or feels the early texture of a dynamic that has cost you before, you do not abandon that signal in favor of the more comfortable interpretation. You do not throw your own perception under the vehicle of your hope. You listen. You take it seriously. You do not catastrophize. The restored self-trust is not the same as hypervigilance, not the hair-trigger alertness of someone who has been hurt and is now scanning everything for threat. It is calmer than that, more grounded. The difference between someone who flinches at every movement because they have been hit before and someone who simply pays attention because they have learned that attention is valuable. The first is fear running the show. The second is wisdom doing its job. Wisdom doing its job looks like this. You meet someone, something about the interaction produces a signal, not necessarily a red flag in the dramatic sense, but a quality of noticing, a small internal annotation. And instead of immediately overwriting that annotation with a more generous reading, you hold it lightly. Let time and further evidence do what time and further evidence are supposed to do. You do not convict anyone on the basis of a signal, but you do not dismiss the signal either. You carry it as information, openly, without urgency, and you watch to see what the accumulating evidence says. That watching, that patient, non-anxious, genuinely curious watching, is what discernment looks like when it is functioning properly. It is not the suspicious monitoring of someone who has decided relationships are dangerous. It is the attentive presence of someone who has learned that the quality of what you build depends enormously on the quality of what you begin with. And here is something about that beginning, about the early stages of connection that follow a period of genuine growth, that is worth preparing yourself for. It will feel different than what you are used to. Not better in the immediate, obvious sense, different in a way that might initially be disorienting precisely because it is healthier. The absence of the particular electricity that characterized the avoidant dynamic, the charged quality of almost connection, the intensity generated by uncertainty, the heightened alertness of someone who is always slightly unsure of where they stand, that absence might initially register as flatness, as the presence of something real feeling, paradoxically less real than the thing that was costing you. That is the nervous system's calibration playing tricks. It was tuned, over the course of the dynamic, to a specific frequency. And that frequency, the particular hum of anxious hope, of intermittent reinforcement, of love that arrived in unpredictable bursts against a background of managed distance, that frequency became familiar enough to feel like the signature of genuine depth, of real connection, of love that actually matters. It is not. Depth does not require uncertainty to be real. Connection does not require anxiety to be genuine. Love that actually matters does not need the threat of its withdrawal to feel significant. Those associations were trained into you by a specific experience. They are not universal truths about what intimacy feels like. They are artifacts of a particular dynamic. And as you encounter healthier connection that is consistent, available, warm without being rationed, the nervous system will need time to recalibrate, to learn that the quiet is not emptiness, that the reliability is not boredom, that the absence of drama is not the absence of depth, but the presence of something more durable than drama ever was. Give the recalibration time, not passive time, active time, time in which you are consciously, gently working to distinguish between genuine incompatibility and unfamiliar safety, between something genuinely lacking and something simply not yet trusted, between a connection that is actually insufficient and a connection that your previously calibrated system is reading as insufficient because it does not activate the old anxiety. The test is not whether it feels like what you had before. The test is whether it meets what you actually need, whether the person is genuinely present or performing presence, whether the warmth is consistent or rationed, whether your full self, unedited, unmanaged, expressed at its actual volume, is received with care or met with the subtle signals of someone who needs you to be smaller than you are. Those tests take time to run. They require the patience of someone who is no longer in a hurry, because the urgency of the old dynamic, the perpetual low-grade emergency of someone whose attachment security was always slightly in question, has been replaced by something steadier. You are not desperate for the connection to be right. You are interested in whether it is right. That shift, from desperation to genuine interest, changes everything about how you evaluate what you encounter. It gives you the space to see clearly rather than hopefully, to choose consciously rather than attach anxiously. The avoidant whose reality you broke, through nothing more and nothing less than the genuine, complete arrival at yourself, is somewhere in their own process right now, their own disorientation, their own revision, their own confrontation with what the pattern cost and what it revealed, and what, if anything, they are willing to do with the revelation. That process belongs entirely to them, its pace, its depth, its direction, its outcome. All of it is theirs. And your life does not wait for it, does not organize itself around the question of where that process is heading, does not hold space in its center for the possibility of a particular outcome on their end. Your life is full, not in a sense of being crowded or busy or distracted from the things that matter, full in the sense of being genuinely inhabited, occupied by your actual presence rather than by the managed, reduced version that the dynamic required. You are in your own life now in a way that you were not for the duration of the dynamic. And being in your own life, really in it, present to it, building it with the full force of your attention and your care and your considerable capacity, is not a consolation for what didn't work out. It is the point. It was always the point. The relationship was never the point. You were always the point. And from inside that fullness, from the life that is genuinely inhabited, from the ground that holds, From the self-trust that has been restored and is daily deepening, the future looks different than it did from inside the dynamic. It looks possible in a way that was difficult to access when so much of your orientation was pointed at one person and one connection, and the question of whether that connection would finally, eventually become what it always had the potential to be. The possible is wide now. It includes love that does not require translation, connection that does not require management, intimacy that is offered freely rather than rationed carefully. A person whose own ground is solid enough that your presence is a gift rather than a threat, whose own healing is sufficiently advanced that the closeness you offer does not trigger the alarm system, who meets your depth with equivalent depth and your consistency with equivalent consistency and your full self with the full force of their own genuine, freely given, unmanaged presence. That person exists. That quality of connection is real. It is not a fantasy constructed from the disappointment of what didn't work. It is the natural destination of two people who have both done enough of their own work to be genuinely available for what they are building together. You are available, more available, in the genuine structural sense than you have ever been. Not because you have lowered your requirements, because you have finally, completely inhabited the self that those requirements were always protecting. The one move that broke their reality was never really one move. It was the culmination of everything, every moment of clarity hard won. Every time you returned to your own ground after the pull tried to drag you back into orbit around their emotional weather. Every small act of self-trust, every refusal to override your own perception, every day you chose your own life over the vigil of waiting for theirs to become what you needed it to be. All of it, accumulated, became the ground. And the ground, solid and genuine and entirely yours, was the thing their reality could not survive contact with, because their reality was built on your availability to be moved. And you are no longer available to be moved. Not because you became hard, because you became whole, and wholeness, genuine, lived, embodied wholeness, is the most quietly revolutionary thing one person can bring into the space where a dynamic used to live. It does not argue, it does not pursue, it does not perform or strategize or wait for recognition. It simply stands on its own ground, in its own light, and everything that cannot meet it there eventually falls away. And everything that can, stays.